Welcome to the third annual Easton Book Festival. I'm going to say thank you to all the sponsors that you see on the background behind me. The festival could not happen without the support of all our sponsors and the community like you out there watching this event. I'm going to highlight a few as I like to do before each of my events. The Greater Easton Development Partnership, the Nurture Nature Center, Start Strong PA, and WDIY, and of course my favorite, Lehigh Valley Poetry, which has an event the first Monday of every month called the Lehigh Valley Poetry Virtual Salon that's got two of the coolest hosts that you will ever meet, one of which is me, and the other of which is Lynn Alexander, who is running tech for us tonight. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our guest, Dr. Katherine Ramsland, who teaches forensic psychology at DeSales University. She has appeared on more than 200 crime documentaries and magazine shows, is an executive producer of Murder House Flip, which I hear is going into a second season now, and has consulted on CSI, Bones, and The Alienist. She has authored like 1 billion articles and books. Okay, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but only a little bit. Including How to Catch a Killer, Haunted Crime Scenes, which she did for us at the Easton Book Festival last year, and these two right here, Bethlehem Ghosts and Murder in the Lehigh Valley, which will be her focus tonight. And I will stop talking now and let Katherine explore the intersection between forensics and paranormal investigations as she does. Katherine?
Okay, I'm sharing my screen and we'll start with Murder in the Lehigh Valley. So I'm calling it Murders in the Lehigh Valley because there are so many. Let me try to get. And this book started after I wrote Bethlehem Ghosts with Dana DeVito. We came across so many interesting cases while we were looking at some of the haunted places in Bethlehem and Easton and Allentown that I decided to also then do a book on just the murders, even though there is crossover. And this one I did in collaboration with Zach Lysick, who's the Northampton County coroner, because he had records and he had ideas, he had memories of things. He's been the coroner for a long time. And the same artist did both covers. And if you look on the cover for the Murder in the Lehigh Valley, it's actually all kinds of murders, not just one. All of those implements were used in some of these murders, including that corkscrew there. So it was a very clever cover, but the two of these books kind of go together because there is overlap, and I will talk a little bit about that tonight. All right, so the sources for my information, bartenders were definitely on the list. That started with the haunted crime scenes, the haunted areas or locations, because bartenders had a lot to say. And so did police and coroners. As I mentioned, I did this with Zach Lysick. Engineers of buildings were able to tell us things. Lots of historians I consulted in Easton and Bethlehem, as well as looking at records from Lehigh University. So got stuff there. Businesses seeking PR, all businesses like to put their haunted things out there. So that certainly helped with finding some of these cases. And when people realized what I was writing about and researching, they all had stories. So I learned quite a bit about some murders, even in my own various neighborhoods where I've lived. I've lived in about 5 different places in the Lehigh Valley, so there's always stories to be found. Certainly newspaper archives and some of the studies that are in collections here. Realtors had stories to tell. There is such a thing as stigmatized properties where bodies have been found. So some of those stories were certainly in the collection. Court records, because in some instances I really wanted to look much more deeply. Ministers. I had one minister tell me about ghosts that show up in his church. And then, of course, people that after I speak about this, people always come up to me afterward and tell me about something that I might not know about. So as a result, between the two of these books, I've really collected a lot. And yet there's still more. I'm going to tell you about a few more that aren't in the book tonight as well. And I will say that these books were written a few years back, so there's some updating that needs to be done. Like I talk about the Wachovia Bank location in Bethlehem, which is Wells Fargo now. So
in the Newburgh Inn. The Newburgh
what?
Inn. You mentioned the Newburgh Inn too, and that's gone now.
Yeah, that's right. It's gone too. Although I think that's not in this presentation. So, yeah, so some things have changed, and but the stories don't. So when I first moved to Hellertown in 2001, I went into an apartment, and within about a month, there was a discovery of a body in a jewelry store on Main Street in Hellertown. And what happened is this guy, the husband of Teresa Fields, had owned or had rented the jewelry store, and he had decided to get out, and he forgot that he left a rug rolled up in the basement. And so the new tenants were cleaning up and found this weird rug that when they stood on it, it seemed to, have this kind of weird feel to it. And as they unrolled it, it was a decomposing body of a woman. She had been there about 2.5 years. And it turned out that she'd been bludgeoned to death. And her husband admitted that he had hit her with a baseball bat, but he said it was in self-defense. She had come at him with the bat. He had taken it away. She went for a gun. So he hit her and killed her, rolled her up in a rug, and moved it from his home near Allentown to the jewelry store that he operated in Hellertown. So he's since been convicted, but that was an interesting thing to happen when I first got into the area. Going back into the 19th century, because I start the book really going into some of the history. I go back about 300 years in the Lehigh Valley, but a lot of it took place in the 19th century. And this was a ghost story originally, but it's also a story about murder. And it's about a woman and her husband who moved into town in Easton, and she was a very beautiful woman. And the wives weren't very happy about all the attention she was getting from their husbands. So at one point, they sort of ganged together and dragged her into this pond, and she didn't survive. They murdered her, but nobody had to pay for this because nobody was talking. And it was a gang of women who just didn't like this interloper coming in and being attractive to their husbands. So apparently the ghost of this woman walks around this area, I think it's 4th Street in Easton, and shows up at the church that's there as well. Another historical event near the Easton area occurred in 1876 and actually made some kind of interesting forensic history, and also affected a case that took place in Bethlehem 5 years later. So Alan Larose was a young man, but he was grown. He was a teacher, and he came to dinner with his family on this particular day in 1876. And there was a boarder in the house as well. So the family and the boarder were all gathered around. And he and his parents had some conflict over money. He wanted them to pay for him to go to law school, and they didn't want to. So they all ended up poisoned by arsenic in the coffee. And he faked that he had been poisoned too, but he recovered fairly quickly. 3 people died, but possibly 4, because later I read an account in the New York Times that said 4 had died. So it's possible one of the children who had become ill had not recovered. At any rate, Alan was the primary suspect. And eventually he did confess. He went to prison. He had been sentenced to be hanged for this triple homicide or quadruple homicide. But because of his fits, and this is back in the 19th century, they'd never do this today, but they kind of thought, well, that's sort of a condition of insanity, and they didn't want to hang an insane man. So they just kept putting it off. And then he escaped from jail, and then they caught him and they brought him back, and he escaped again. And then they didn't catch him. And it turned out, I did some research with someone, it turned out he ended up, I think, in Texas, and he got a teaching license there. So he kind of got away with this, this murder of members of his family. And then in Bethlehem, about 5 years later, we have another really horrific crime. Edward Snyder was another boarder living with the Gogos family. And he took a shine to their daughter, Alice, I think, who was only about 14 years old. And he was warned to stay away from her, but he didn't like that. So one night after the family had gone to bed, and in fact, there was a visiting family too, because there were children staying over as well. But after everyone was in bed, he picked up an axe from the woodpile and slaughtered Google and his wife, and then went upstairs to find Alice, the older daughter, and she fought him off. So he left the scene, but then for some reason came back, and he mingled among people and tried to pass off a fake story of somebody else who had come in. But a railroad detective came on the scene, and this actually ended up being the first lynching in Pennsylvania history, because the more people who mingled around, and Alice started saying, "This is the guy who did it. This is the guy who killed my parents." And there they were lying in bed, completely cut up. People were going into the bedroom to have a look, and they decided that because of what had happened in the Larose incident, where he got away with murder, basically, this was not going to happen. They did not trust at all the judicial system, and they decided that they were going to string him up. He did confess that he had done it, said he'd do it again. They decided they'd string him up right there in the yard in that tree. And we have at the back cover of my book, the lynching. And here were some of the drawings that came out of this incident. And Lehigh University has this in their archives. But this was really a pretty grim, horrible double homicide in the Lehigh Valley. And in part, the execution of the perpetrator came out of what had happened to the Larose and to Alan Larose. And that first of all, they didn't want to waste tax money on a trial. That was one thing. And secondly, they didn't want to trust this guy's fate to the judicial system that had let Larose off. So that's how he ended up hanged. And this is a ghost story as well, because what happened is people took all kinds of souvenirs from the house, from the tree. They basically decimated the tree, taking little chips and chunks out of it. But the tree's still there, and people apparently see his ghost and the ghosts of the murdered couple there. So that's along the Monocacy stream, river, whatever they call the Monocacy. All right, another historical one that made real forensic history in America was the Getter trial. Charles Getter had been in love with two women, Molly and Martha, but Martha said she was pregnant, so he had to marry her, and he didn't want to. He loved Molly, so Martha ended up dead. So her ghost walks around in the Easton area. But more interestingly is what happened to Charles Getter. When he went to trial, he claimed that he didn't do it, that he was innocent. They had several experts saying that she had died from apoplexy, or her brain couldn't stand the stress of being pregnant. I'm not even sure she was pregnant, but it could have just been a story. But at any rate, that's what they had decided. But Samuel Gross was a young doctor, and he has claimed that this case was one of the most significant of his career. He had studied some of the budding forensics that was going on in France and Scotland. And he decided to do more a scientific approach. So you won't probably like this, but he strangled some animals to dissect their necks to see what it was like. And he found the same thing in the victim. So he testified for the prosecution that Getter had in fact strangled her. And a number of prominent doctors went up against him for the defense, and he stood alone, and he stood by what he had claimed. And eventually Getter actually did confess. So Gross was right. But mostly, I think it was just the logic of the case that, the woman he didn't love ended up dead. And it was especially back then, the simplest explanation was that he did it. So he then was sentenced to hang. And on the day when he was to be executed, he was going to be hanged on this island out in the Eastern River that anybody can see today. It's called Getter's Island for this reason. And he had asked, instead of being dropped from the gallows, he wanted to be it's called the upright jerker. He wanted to be brought up to be hanged. And so they said, okay, that's fine. So he dressed in a white suit. He had to step across a flotilla of boats to get to the island after his march through town. And then they put the rope around his neck, jerked it up, and it broke. And you can actually go to the Easton Museum, and if they have the ropes on display, they have a whole box full of hanging ropes there in the Easton Museum. And you can see how thin it was, and that why would anybody think this would work? But anyway, so he had to sit there for half an hour while they went back and got another rope, and then again, tried it again. This time he was executed. So it's called Getter's Island for that. And also the idea is that his ghost shows up on this island as well. So it's not just a story about murder and love triangles, but also a ghost story. Another forensic story that happened in Allentown. Molly Bechtel was found murdered, lying in an alley near her home. This is another love triangle. She had worked in the silk mills, but she wanted to get married. Her family had picked out an appropriate fiance for her, but she didn't like him. She liked somebody else. So there was a lot of dispute about that. And she ended up dead. The entire family was suspected in her murder. One of the brothers committed suicide, but the mother and the mother, the sister, and two brothers were suspected of murdering her inside the house where there were bloodstains. And right at this time, a test for distinguishing animal blood from human blood had been discovered. But at the trial, it was a battle of experts. And there was an expert from Lafayette and an expert from Lehigh saying this blood test was unproven. There's no way. It doesn't work. And the person who's claiming that it works to show that her blood is in the house, they're just wrong because this doesn't work. And in fact, it is the best test, and we still use it today. So that person was right. She was murdered inside the house, but because of all the dispute among the experts, the jury didn't know what to do. So they ended up acquitting the whole family. So nobody paid the price unless, of course, you think the brother who committed suicide and knew what was going on. But it was an interesting case just because we have all these eminent people from our universities making false claims and they were totally wrong. And as a result, we have a serious injustice in the courts. All right, let's get us into some modern times here. This one, whoops, I misspelled her name. It's just two Z's, no S in there, Richeza Williams, 1996. She was a runaway from New York who got involved in some people doing drugs in Easton, some dope sellers, and they thought that she had cheated them. I think she was 13, they thought she was 15, but they thought she had cheated them. So 3 of them took her down in the basement, and this is where the corkscrew comes in. They tortured her with all kinds of implements and murdered her and dumped her into this tomb in the Easton Cemetery. It's not easy to find. You have to kind of walk around and come around to the other side, but her body was found here. This was featured on a Forensic Files show, and her body was found in there. And this again becomes forensic because at the time, the forensic odontologist was brought in because there was a piece of gum, chewed gum, on the floor of this vault. And it turned out to match the teeth of one of the suspects. And so he was arrested. I believe 2 of them ended up going to trial, and I think the 3rd one got away. But anyway, so that's an Easton Cemetery tale of murder. And another one, this also came out of doing ghost stories, but a woman named Ruth Mickley was found on a couch one night in 1949. At the time, this building was, in fact, a nightclub called the Colonnade. And there were a number of suspects. But the odd thing was she was found on a couch, but they decided that she had fallen down the stairs. So she's found on the couch, her head bludgeoned. There are a number of suspects. They all passed polygraphs. And the DA quickly closed the case and said it was an accident, because all the suspects he had passed polygraphs, which was very stupid reasoning, or else he was bought off, because there was a lot of talk that she had been killed by someone in organized crime, and that the DA had been warned away from really taking on this case. So the ghost of a woman is seen not only around the building where the Wells Fargo Bank is, but also the former Boyd Theater. So, and those 2 buildings are pretty close together on the same side of that street. But unfortunately, the Boyd Theater is in kind of collapse at this point. But I actually had an experience there. So this is a ghost story, I guess. When they were still showing movies, I went in to meet a friend, and I think I came in after her, and she said that she had come in, seen me in the movie theater. It was a fairly large theater across the way. I apparently turned and waved to her, and then she turned around and saw me enter the theater behind her. She looked back and nobody was there. So it wasn't me. I don't know who it was. Maybe it was Ruth Mickley. I don't know. I don't know if the ghost is Ruth Mickley, but I do know there's no way that a case would be closed that fast, or that a victim of falling down the stairs would end up on the couch. So I think the DA closed the case too fast, and this woman might be looking for justice. All right, so one of the most infamous triple homicides in the Lehigh Valley is the Freeman brothers. 1995, the 2 skinhead, I think it's called the Skinhead Murders. There's a book on it. There's a number of, I think I've done 3 documentaries alone on this. And essentially, these 2 guys, Brian and David Freeman, were huge guys. I knew some people who went to high school with them, and they were just very, well over 6 feet tall, large, and their parents were trying to raise them as Jehovah's Witnesses. So there are a lot of restrictions on them that they didn't like. So they were constantly in conflict with their parents, and they had a cousin named Benny Birdwell. So the 3 of them together were constantly in conflict with the Dennis Freeman and his wife. And they had a younger brother as well. And at one point, the younger brother had mentioned to an aunt, asked her if she would take his dog because she's afraid his brothers were going to kill them all. And he was right. That's exactly what happened. They got into a conflict with the mother. Benny they had a basement bedroom, and Benny was there, and she kept ordering him to leave, and he'd come back in through a window. And finally she went down and I think it was, can't remember which one of them stabbed her. I think it was Brian stabbed her. And then the others went and took a baseball bat and smashed the father's head and the brother's head. So it was a triple homicide. They then took off across Pennsylvania, thinking that they were going to find some kind of refuge on a farm in Michigan. But those skinheads didn't want anything to do with them and turned them in. They were brought back here. They are now petitioning to be released because, except for Birdwell, who was 18, both of them one was 15, one was 17. So they're asking now for the courts to reconsider their life sentences, because as juveniles at the time of the crime, they now fall under the new rulings in the Supreme Court that no juveniles will be given life sentences without parole, no matter what they did. So they've been petitioning to. Say it again.
How likely do you think it is that they'll get off?
Likely, because of all the research on the adolescent brain. I think they can definitely plead. It was a crime of passion. Essentially, they had just gone to a movie. I think 2 of them had seen Murder in the First, and there had been a great deal of conflict in the family, and it was a very reactive kind of crime. It wasn't premeditated, even though they'd made a lot of threats. It was a reactive crime. It certainly falls into the arena of the juvenile, the immature juvenile brain. And I mean, even when they took off, they didn't have any supplies. They didn't really have any way to disguise themselves. So I think it's pretty likely that they're going to win that eventually. Maybe not right now, but they will. There are a number of juveniles in Pennsylvania prisons that are petitioning for this hearing. So I think that's possible. And then down the road in Emmaus, Jeff Howard was watching the news about the Freeman brothers, decided that was pretty cool, and he murdered his parents and took off, ran out of gas, was apprehended, and he continues to be evaluated. He ended up actually getting a very rare verdict, not guilty by reason of insanity, because the jury decided that he really was mentally ill. And he continues to be evaluated, I think, every 2 or 3 years, and continues to be considered a potential danger. So, but he did this because he thought what the Freeman brothers had done was very cool. He wanted to do that too, and he'd been harboring thoughts of murdering his parents since he was a little kid. Not because they were abusive, just he didn't like being compared to his older brother, who was doing everything right. He was having trouble in school, and he just decided because they had done it, he could do it too. Harvey Robinson is not only a Lehigh Valley serial killer, he's one of the youngest serial killers in the country. He started killing when he was 17, and then continued until he was 18. He attacked 5 people, killing 3, raping 2, including a 5-year-old child, before he was caught in a very interesting sting operation where they had decided, the police had decided, this is in Allentown, that he was going to come back and eliminate the witnesses, especially the adult woman who had survived, Denise Samcali. And so they put officers into the home where the 5-year-old child had been attacked, and they put an officer into the home of Denise Samcali, with the idea of these victims were going to be bait for this serial killer. And they waited and waited and waited. And they were going to give it, a certain period of time. And toward the end of that period, when they weren't really sure this was going to work, Harvey Robinson broke into Denise Samcali's house. And there was a shootout and whatnot, but he managed to get away, but he was wounded. So they ended up catching him at Lehigh Valley Hospital. Very interesting. I actually interviewed the officer, Brian Lewis, I think his name was, and what an unusual and unique experience it was for him to be part of this whole sting operation. It's a very unusual way to catch a serial killer, but it worked. And so Harvey Robinson was apprehended. He's also alive. He continues to petition the court for any number of reasons why his trial was not fair, or his attorneys were ineffective, or he actually had a medical condition that they should have recognized, and et cetera, et cetera. He was terrible in terms of trying to help his attorneys. He couldn't give them anything in terms of character witnesses or whatnot. So, and then he had a couple of death sentences, one of which got overturned. I think he had 3. 2 got over. One was overturned because he was 17. And the Supreme Court had eliminated all death sentences for anyone under the age of 18. Another was overturned for another reason, technical reason. I think there's still one remaining, and he's constantly chipping away at that one. So that's another one. The Freemans and Harvey Robinson have been back in court several times to try to have some differences. And then Martin Apple, who wanted to be executed. I actually don't know what's happened to him, but in 1986, he decided to rob a bank in Bath. And he had targeted a bank, and he had decided to leave no witnesses. He had an accomplice as well. He had decided to leave no witnesses. So when he went in to do this, and I think John Morganelli has written a book on this called D-Day, something like that. So when he went in to do this, he did shoot people, but he didn't get everybody. And it was badly planned, every which way. He did hit kind of a mad car chase, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very interesting book. I mean, I certainly recommend anyone who's interested in local crimes to look at it. But he was caught, and then immediately said, he wanted the death penalty. So he played the system actually very well, and basically got no death penalty just because of the way he did it. It's very convoluted, and I don't want to go into it tonight, but I definitely recommend Morganelli's book. It's pretty peculiar. This was a crime in 2010. Michael Ballard had been in prison for 17 years in Allentown for the murder of somebody. And he had a relationship with the young woman, and she had broken up with him, and he had heard she was seeing someone else. So he got out on parole. And when he got into a jealous fit and went over to her house, stabbed her to death. Her father, her grandfather basically beheaded him. And a neighbor heard all this commotion and came over to try to help, and he ended up murdered. And then, so after this quadruple homicide, Ballard got into a car and took off, and he ran into a tree. And an off-duty officer came up to him and saw all this blood on him, thought, something terrible had happened in this accident. And he basically just said, I killed them all. So this officer didn't even know what he was talking about, but then pretty quickly found out about this quadruple homicide, and Ballard was apprehended. I have a number of drawings of his. Somebody came up to me at a book signing and just said, I have all these drawings that Michael Ballard did here, and left them with me. Anyway, I thought this was kind of an interesting one. I can't say much for his artistic talent, but that's apparently what he's doing. And then Charles Cullen, this is my book on healthcare serial killers. It's kind of funny that Charles Cullen from the Lehigh Valley ended up on the cover, because I cover serial killers all over the world, and yet he's the guy on the cover. And they didn't even realize at the time that he was somebody who killed people in our hospitals. But Charles Cullen in December 2003 was arrested and taken to court on the suspicion of an attempted murder and another murder in Somerset County, I guess like a hospital center, medical center. And while before the judge, he just started confessing and said that he had murdered a lot of people and did not want an attorney. He wanted the death penalty. And, so a lot of things happened that were not at all what he was expecting, but it was such a bizarre admission because nobody suspected him of all these other murders. But yes, and in fact, they did, because what he had done was gone from one hospital to another. Every time someone began to suspect him of doing something to patients or messing with the medications, he'd find a way to get out. Zach Lysick, the coroner I just mentioned, he thought that there was an angel of death at Easton Hospital. It was Cullen, but Cullen was there through a temp agency. So Zach knew the name Charles, and they said, well, we don't have anyone named Charles working here. Well, they did, but as a temp. So he had a number of different ways of getting through the system. And then he just moved from one hospital to another, in part because the laws protected him. Without evidence, they were not allowed to pass along their suspicions. Those laws have since changed because of this case in New Jersey and in Pennsylvania. But it used to be that administrators could not warn other institutions if they had suspicions about someone, because if they had evidence, then they should turn it over to the police. If they don't have evidence and they only have suspicions, they were not allowed to say anything, or even to withhold any kind of recommendations. So that has changed in part because of the Cullen case. So that's another of the Lehigh Valley's serial killers, but he's a healthcare serial killer. He was at St. Luke's and Easton and a Phillipsburg hospital and a few other places as well here. Cedar Crest, was he in Cedar Crest? I can't remember. Anyway, he was in a number of places. Do you know?
Really quickly,
Sure.
didn't the book say something about him suggesting ways that hospitals could improve their security measures?
Yeah, when he did this long interview with these detectives in New Jersey, I was actually, that was interesting because I got contacted by the New Jersey Star-Ledger before anyone in Pennsylvania even realized what was going on with this case, because Cullen had confessed to these, all of it to these two detectives. And then he proceeded to explain how hospitals could, should be more careful about their medications and about their, even the computerized systems that they were using were easy to get around. And so, yeah, he had a whole list of things so he basically blamed the institutions for allowing someone like him to operate and did not take any responsibility for himself. In the end, I think he confessed to 29 murders and 6 attempted murders. And I know that people suspect there are more than that. But that's, that was the deal he made. So from the first day was, I don't want an attorney. I just want the death penalty, to he made a deal for his life by talking about the different people he had killed. And he always said that it was through mercy because they were like burn patients or cancer patients or whatnot. But when you look at all the murders against his personal timeline, it was always about when something was wrong in his life, his divorce, or threatening to have his children taken away from him, or suicide attempts, or being fired from someplace. That's when he would kill people. And they weren't in the worst conditions. One guy had just gone in for a bee sting, something like that, and he ended up dead. So Cullen is a liar, that's for sure. He's the only serial killer that's ever been on 60 Minutes, and I have no idea why they decided to do that, but they did once do an interview with him. He's just like any other serial killer. It's all about him. But I think because at one time he did this kind of nice gesture where he gave a kidney to somebody, something like that. People have more compassion for him, but he didn't have any compassion for the victims, and that's a pretty high victim count. He also corresponded with probably one of the country's most prolific serial killers, Donald Harvey, who was also a healthcare serial killer, who claimed at one point that he had killed 87 people. And Cullen had paid attention to that case. So that kind of makes it look more like, he was trying to figure out ways to do this and get away with it. But anyway, so that's Cullen. There's a lot to that story. There's some in the book, but there's a lot more in the healthcare serial killer book. And there's also good book called The Good Nurse about the whole case. All right, so cold cases. There are a whole list of them. Each, like Morgan Alley had put out a list. Just before we were going to press, had put out a list of 25. People like Holly Brannigan, which I think people know that it's sort of closed because the man who stabbed her to death is probably dead. And I think they couldn't actually launch a case because they didn't have enough evidence, but I think people pretty much knew who that was. And then Charlotte Bemiano was a realtor who was found dead in one of the houses that she was supposedly showing to somebody. And actually her death occurred during a time when there was a serial killer killing realtors. So I've never been able to make much of a case about that. But I've always thought that would be interesting to see how similar was her murder. But I actually think it was somebody she knew, who definitely knew the house, because whoever it was had pulled their car around to a kind of a hiding place. So that's another one. There's actually quite a few cold cases in the Lehigh Valley. But one of the ones I wanted to also mention, it's not actually in the Lehigh Valley, it's over by Carlisle, near Gettysburg. But it's a good case. It's a really interesting case. It's known as the Babes in the Woods, and it happened in 1934. And I've been doing these haunted crime scene weekends in Gettysburg with Mark and Carol Nesbitt. So we did this case a couple of times because we could go to the scene where these girls were left, and also they're buried in the cemetery there. So we were able to actually do sort of field trips. But this is basically the picture of these three young girls who were found in the woods in November 1934 with no identification, nobody knew who they were. They had been starving, but each of them had been killed with asphyxiation, and then gently laid on this blanket and covered with the blanket. So that was weird. But then very close after the discovery of their bodies was a murder-suicide in this railroad hut in Duncansville near Altoona. Again, two complete strangers. And people wondered, was there some link between this murder-suicide of these adults and these 3 kids being dumped in the woods near Carlisle? So they took pictures. This is the man and the woman, because they wanted to publicize this and see if anybody knew who they were. Nobody in the area seemed to know them. And this rifle was at the scene with kind of a broken piece on it. But I mean, not so broken it couldn't be used effectively, because that's exactly what the weapon was. And so people remembered them. They were strangers who had hitchhiked into town. They'd stayed at the Congress Hotel. They gave a name, which turned out to be nothing. A woman below them had heard pacing, and a young woman saying, "Oh my." And someone else came forward and said the man had tried to sell his glasses and said he wouldn't be needing them. She sold her coat. It was winter, it's November, it was cold. She sold her coat and then bought this broken Stevens rifle. They were both seen by another person, another witness, walking on the railroad track toward that little house. And they had lit a fire there before they committed the murder-suicide. And she had clearly done it willingly, because she had held her dress away from where she got shot in the chest. And then he shot himself. But again, no ID, no clarity in who they were. Were they related to the kids? And then about 2.5 miles from the kids, someone found this bag, which turned out to have all these clothes in it. Pretty good clothes in pretty good condition, but they looked like they would have fit the kids. And then, so they put the picture of the girls in the media, hoping somebody was going to be able to come forward and identify them, but they didn't. So they took hair and nail clippings, sent them to the forensic lab, trying to figure out what in the world is this case. But they did find this. Let me just get rid of this. But they did find this car that had run out of gas, that had a sort of plastic tube on the tailpipe, no license plate, nothing like that. So again, another weird mystery. What was it doing out in the middle of this field? And then they found out who the guy was. Somebody in California was able to identify him. His name is Elmo Knox. And he had recently left California. He had recently bought that car. He'd never driven a car before, ever. He had recently bought that car, loaded up his kids and his niece, who was the young woman who was helping him to watch them. His wife had died. And she was helping to watch the kids. And they had loaded them up and left a meal out on the table. So like he was in a hurry for some reason that nobody could figure out, and just took off across the country, never having driven a car before, bought this car, took off across the country from California all the way to Philadelphia, because they were seen there. Once they had a sense of who this was, they were able to sort of track their movements. And they went at a pretty fast pace to get to Philadelphia for some reason that nobody knew what it could be. And then came back through the Gettysburg area into Carlisle. And then those kids were dumped in the woods, and these two committed murder-suicide, or he did. So the kids were identified. They were his children. And it was a mystery. So that's a cold case that I just had to throw in here because I find it very fascinating. There's a lot more to it, the autopsy reports and whatnot. Clearly they had been starved. They had not eaten for days. He had run out of money. That's why he sold his niece's coat to get the gun. Why she agreed to help him kill these girls and also then, have him kill her. Who knows? But that's why it's a cold case. So we know their identities. We know that he and possibly she murdered the 3 children. But what were they doing in Pennsylvania? Why did they leave California so fast? And, what was the plan and why did they come to this extreme set of circumstances? Nobody knows. So anyway, that's my talk.
All right. Thank you so much. That was really cool. There were some really interesting things in there, but there is some even more in Murder in the Lehigh Valley, the book, that Katherine did not talk about tonight. And I just wanted to mention that we have copies of this for sale at the Lafayette College store on 211 McCartney Street. And I will keep those in stock for you guys if anybody would like to stop by and purchase some. And I will try to put a link on this event also so that you can buy online if you wish.
Did you guys have any questions? Because I know that Darrell, you read the book. Did you have any more questions or anything other of the cases that you thought were?
Just, I'm interested. I think I know the answer to this, but
Okay.
just because I'm interested in it. So you mentioned the Easton Cemetery. That's like one of my favorite places to walk because I can actually walk there from my house and take a walk in there and then walk back, which I do frequently. So are there any ghosts at the Easton Cemetery?
Yes. You'll have to buy Bethlehem Ghosts if you want that story. Yes, that was one of the ones that really drew me to to do a lot of the work in Easton. In fact, I think most of the really good stories came out of Easton for both books. But what I love about the Easton Cemetery is it's one of the few garden cemeteries that actually were designed in the middle of the 19th century for a particular purpose. And that purpose was recreation, coupled with the ability to see beautiful art. So it was for picnicking, gatherings of community and whatnot. We don't think about cemeteries like that anymore. But during those days, it started in Boston, Mount Auburn. There's one in Philadelphia. There's one in Ann Arbor, Michigan. There's one in Easton. There's one in New York or Brooklyn. You can't find them just anywhere, but when you do find them, they're beautiful. They're wonderful. So it was this kind of weird movement.
Some of us still think of them that way because Lynn threw me a birthday party at the Easton Cemetery last year. So
yeah, and the ghost is a female in white, the typical ghost, but different people think of her for different stories. Some people think she's the same ghost that was in the Easton Library. And there's a lot of goings on, especially at night in the library. So I collected a number of ghost stories from them, and some people think because the proximity that maybe she's the one responsible for that. I believe that there are some people buried underneath the parking lot of that library. So some people think it's related to that. It's hard to tell. It's very easy, like in that Wells Fargo building, we know Ruth Mickley died there, and we know that she never got justice. So yeah, it's pretty simple to attach the woman in white to, potentially her, but a ghost in a cemetery, whoa, there could be so many people. So, I think it depends on who you ask, what the story is attached to her, but there certainly have been sightings.
cool. Did you have any comments, Lynn? Any thoughts?
Well, I do. And I think one of the other interesting things about, historically burials is that there are also throughout Easton a lot of places where there are people buried in not necessarily cemeteries because, there were, because that was a practice. So sometimes I'm curious about that. The problem with these questions is I have so many things I would ask you, Katherine, that we need to bring you back and we need to do this a few more times because, there's so many things. One of the things that I've been curious about when you mentioned the Bechtel case and the, the expert testimony and the way that, obviously each side has their opinions. I'm just curious, when you mention things like the blood test, what you think are some of like the big, the big innovations to modern forensic science like that, where, we're able to have things like those kinds of tests that are sort of indisputable, that are an opinion. We have this test now so we can know for sure,
Well, DNA, obviously, and that was disputed for its first few years in the courts, heavily disputed, in part because prosecutors are making wildly exaggerated claims and big numbers of probabilities without knowing what they were talking about. But it's probably now the best tested forensic evidence we have. And now we have genetic DNA that is identifying, is linking cold cases to killers or rapists. I think one just happened this week in Pennsylvania. I think it was in the morning call, maybe today or yesterday. So the genealogical DNA has really opened a lot of doors. And some of the cold cases we have could possibly be linked that way as well. So probably that's more important than any other test, but really anything in the realm of biological or chemical evidence, certainly far superior to behavioral evidence, which is highly interpretable. But that would be, I just found it so ironic that, they had an expert who said, it's a new test that can differentiate human from animal blood. And we had all these eminent people from our eminent universities disputing it. No way, no way. Who had never tested it, never even tried it, but just used their status to say, no, he's just wrong. And so to me, it's kind of an ironic case and a sad case, because she did not get justice. And the guy who said this test works was right. And we still use that same test.
Well, thank you. And like I said, I would ask you questions all night. So I'll let Darrell, I'm sure he's got a few before we let you go. So I will turn it back to Darrell.
Okay, as Lynn likes to do. I don't think I really had any other questions, but
was there any story that stood out that I didn't cover? I thought
actually, yes, there is. There is the murder at Lehigh University, because it was the fact that it was the reason that I see Lafayette giving us crime statistics every single year. That just blew my mind. That the whole reason that came about was because of a murder that happened at Lehigh University.
Right, and because of what students were doing, leaving the doors blocked open so that it was more convenient for them to come in and out. And so somebody got in and killed a young woman. So yeah, and we have that at DeSales as well. We have the crime statistics and as a result of that case. And there certainly are more in the book that, as I mentioned, it is, I don't even remember what year I published it, because there have been so many murders since then. And some of the ones that I have in the list of cold cases have been solved too. So
that's interesting.
Yeah.
You need to do an updated version.
I have other books to write.
Yeah. You're a very busy lady. So yeah, we got
oh, I have a chat here.
What's that?
There's something in the chat.
No.
Oh, okay. All right. Go ahead.
Okay. Did you have another question, Lynn? Go for it. Oh, no? No, you're good. Okay. So yeah, we've got like lots of Easton in this book, and there's not even surprising amount of Easton in Bethlehem Ghosts. I know,
because I got so many great stories, and the historians were willing to help me in Easton in ways I didn't get assistance in other areas, but there were just so many great stories that ended up being a lot about Easton.
Yeah, so that's why it's good to have the Bethlehem Ghosts at the Easton Book Festival, because there's lots of Easton in the Bethlehem Ghosts as well. So like the whole back of the book seems to be
Yeah, I
Easton.
think the whole final fourth section is all Easton. Yeah.
Yeah. And we have Murder in the Lehigh Valley, we have Lafayette, we have Lehigh, we have like all the prominent schools factored in. And yeah, I thought that was really cool. And I like the fact that a lot of these were like ones that I remember, like from growing up and stuff, like hearing about. But I really didn't pay all that much attention to them at the time. And now to look back and find like the triple homicide in the West Ward was an interesting one too, that I'm sure people in the Easton area would be interested to read about. But we'll let them read the book for that one. We'll let them come on the book. So.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. I enjoyed being here.
Yes, thank you for being here. And thank you everybody who is tuning into this presentation. And have a great night and enjoy the rest of the festival.